Okay, so this paper is called Barriers to Change, Possibilities for Resistance. That's the probably less interesting title. The more interesting title is the subtitle, which says Implementation and the Ideology of Individualism. And basically what my goal is, or what I want you to all take away from this talk, is to caution against what I see as a movement towards a kind of individualism with respect to our understanding of the implementation challenge of conceptual engineering for social kind concepts. That's really important. I want to stress that I'm a social and political philosopher first. I'm specifically interested in topics in the critical philosophy of race and gender. And I approach these topics from the point of view of conceptual engineering. So my main concern is with the social world, or unjust social hierarchy in particular, and how it relates to social kind concepts. Okay, so I have this funky quote that I was just going to read, which says, biological evolution requires inheritance and mutations. Similarly, cultural evolution requires both conformity and innovation. I'm going to treat concepts as a cultural phenomenon. I hope that's not too controversial. I'll say a bit more about what that means. And as a cultural phenomenon, the evolution of concepts requires both conformity and innovation, mainly conformity to sort of new conceptual practices. But what I'm going to argue today is that conformity also stifles innovation, right? Which should be all that surprising. But there are all sorts of social forces and infrastructure that keep things conceptually as they are, or maintain the conceptual status quo. So there's a few things I want to discuss before I get into the meat of the talk. And I just want to spend some time situating myself in the literature. So I have two targets. I have my first target is existing formulations of the implementation challenge. My second target is proposed strategies for how we might bring about conceptual change. What I'm going to suggest is both focus too squarely on individuals. In particular, such proposed strategies, the proposed strategies for implementation, are concerned with the role of individual conceptual advocacy in dominant speech situations. So here I have in mind, Delia's talk yesterday, but also people like Rachel Sturken, Elizabeth Amber Cantelamessa, Mark Pinder, Sigurd Joram, and even Max Deutsch. So, and I'll go through those positions later on. So I want to stress that none of these theorists purport to offer the final word on how it is we might go about revising our conceptual practices, right? And there is certainly something to be said about the idea of the role of individuals in conversation and trying to get people to adopt new practices with the term. Conversation is part of our everyday lives. But what I'm going to argue is that we should not expect that we will ever or even often be in a position where we'll have the requisite control over conversational processes to effectively change the thinking and speaking practices of others. We're always going to be up against barriers to change, some of which I'm going to elucidate today. So to further situate this talk, I'm going to put what I said in the language that's been sort of introduced in the literature. So this talk is a contribution to the discussion on conceptual control. And this is more along the lines that Jürgen Fischer has discussed in his recent paper and inquiry with respect to higher order cognitive competencies, rather than Hermann Kaplan's concern with the limits of intended meaning revision, given a kind of moderate metasemantic externalism. But I diverge from Fischer insofar as I'm not strictly interested in internal control gaps, or what we might call conceptual self-control. Right? I'm not going to speak about the ability of an agent to abide by a new normative explanation or a conceptual engineering proposal. But my concern is closer to Kaplan's in the sense that I'm interested in what's going on outside of the head and beyond the individual, or what we might call conceptual other control. I'm concerned with the social forces and infrastructure that maintain classificatory dispositions in a community and which makes convincing others to take up an ameliorative proposal of very tall order. So here's what I want to actually achieve today, a bit more clearly. Conceptual other control, and therefore conceptual change, is really hard in social environments that work to maintain the conceptual status quo. Because of this, we must reevaluate our approach to the implementation challenge for social kind concepts to be less individualistic, in particular, less attentive to the role of individual conceptual advocacy. And we need to focus on building smaller communities of conceptual practice to let concepts develop and propagate within non-dominant contexts so that they stand a better chance of flourishing within dominant situatedness. Right. That's basically what I want to get out of this talk. Whether I can do it all, that remains to be seen, but Good luck to me. Okay, so here's what's to come. I'm going to tell you what concepts are, or what I think they are. Then I'm going to very quickly say what conceptual engineering is supposed to achieve, at least for my purposes. And then I'll say, I'll get to the kind of more interesting parts, which is the implementation challenge of conceptual control. I'll introduce what I mean by the ideology of individualism and this notion of conceptual reproduction, or tribes conceptual reproduction. And then if I get time, I might say something about, how we might rethink the implementation challenge. Okay, so what are concepts? What's the subject matter of conceptual engineering? I'm just going to state my position. My interest is in systematically linked knowledge structures within a community, non-factive knowledge structures within a community, which ground our shared and public classificatory dispositions. Right, that's what I'm interested in. So I'm interested in these kind of higher order cognitive competencies. In my previous work, I was interested in kind of two aspects of our cognition. These what Elizabeth Camp calls characterizations, which is a rich collection of attributed features to a subject. Mostly sort of generic characterizations like stereotypes. But today I'm just going to talk about classificatory dispositions, beliefs or opinions about the things that fall under the same kind. And for my purposes, they're not abstract. They're actually part of our community. They're kind of instantiated, which is compared to Jennifer Nader's recent work on classificatory procedures, which are abstract. So in my way of thinking, the goal of conceptual engineering is to change shared and public classificatory dispositions. But you might think, why do we even want to go and do that? I'm going to do this really, really quickly. What's conceptual engineering supposed to achieve? Well, different theorists have different aims. For my purposes, conceptual engineering is supposed to contribute to achieving a world in which there are more just social relations, or to advance pursuits in the project of social justice. You might think, okay, in what sense conceptual engineering achieve this? Well, if you sort of buy into this idea that there are looping effects between our practices of classification and facts about the social world, then you can kind of see how classificatory, by changing our classificatory dispositions, we can actually change sort of facts about social injustice. Here I've got a quote from Hacking. All I really want to say is that I think Hacking's definition of looping effect is a bit too narrow. It's not just about people who are able to take on a particular self-conception. I think you can have looping effects for material things out there. So how does this relate to social justice? Well, some of our social kinds or classifications aren't just, and some kinds or classifications we should have don't exist at all. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the literature on social epistemology or epistemic injustice, but for those who are, have in mind things like resolving hermeneutical injustice, or resolving ontological oppression, or what Catherine Jenkins calls ontic injustice. Those don't really matter. If you want to talk about them in question time, we can do that. Okay, so here's why you're all here. Talk about the implementation challenge. I hope that was enough sort of background information to be useful to you. So with all of this said, we might ask, well, that was my dog, I'm so sorry. Conceptual engineering seems all well and good in theory, but how do we actually go about getting people to adopt a proposed conceptual practice? I think that this, in essence, is what the implementation challenge is. It's not a precise definition. I'm trying to stay clear from precise definitions because I think they get us into all sorts of trouble. But this gets to the heart of what I think the implementation challenge is. What does implementation really mean? I guess some things just to clear up. The subject of implementation is going to be an ameliorated classificatory practice. The scope for my interests is going to be the concepts that constitute a public language, right? A collective resource, conceptual resource shared across social subgroups. And there's a bunch of different ways in which you might implement a concept. You can introduce one, you can eliminate a concept, you can revise an existing concept, you can replace an existing concept, and controversially, you can preserve them. This is a recent position offered by Matthew Lindauer. So, these are the sorts of things that I have in mind. Okay. So implementation, sort of just looking at some of the details here, presupposes some kind of control, if it's possible, right? Control over conceptual practices within a community. So what makes the implementation challenge a challenge is whether we have control over certain classificatory dispositions within a community. But what kind of conceptual control should we be interested in? think there's one kind of thing, which is like conceptual self-control, which is the ability of thinkers to bring their exercise of classification in line with a particular normative proposal, right? So this is your intrapersonal effort to change your own classificatory disposition, say with the word woman to be trans-inclusive or something like that. This is a Fisher-inspired definition for those who have read that article. You might also think of the difficulties you can have when you have to change your pronoun usage for someone else that you're sort of been familiar with or have grown up with. It can be really difficult, but it's something like you have to control your practices of classification with the proposal. Another kind of control you might be interested in is conceptual other control, right? Which is the ability of thinkers to bring another's exercise of classification in line with a particular normative proposal. This is what I'm going to be interested in. This is the interpersonal effort to change another's classificatory disposition, say with the word woman so as to be trans-inclusive. And obviously this is much harder, right? We'll have to deal with a kind of another variable here, which is just like someone else's mind and whether or not they're going to be receptive to the things that you're saying. And we have even less control in this process. But nevertheless, I think it's still possible. I still think it's possible that we're able to change other people's minds. And I also think that this is the kind of conceptual control that seems to be implicit in recent literature, right? So this is what I'm going to explore next, that this different accounts of conceptual other control. Okay, so I've spoken really quickly to get to this point, so I promise I'm going to slow down. At the start of the talk, I said that existing formulations and proposed strategies discussed in recent literature are just too individualistic. So you might ask, what exactly does this mean? There are a number of different candidates, right? There's sort of ontological individualism, which is the social world is exhaustively constituted by individuals and their relations and interactions. Right, so you just get individuals and their attitudes and the way that they interact with one another. Or there's an explanatory individualism, which is that social phenomena should be explained in terms of individuals, their attitudes and interactions. So this is a bit more normative. It's about explanation. So if you want to know why it is that consumer spending habits have changed during the COVID-19 pandemic, according to the explanatory individualist, all you need to do is appeal to facts about individuals, their attitudes and their interactions with one another, such as like panic buying toilet paper because you think everyone else is going to buy toilet paper and the stores are going to close and all sorts of things like that. The third kind of individualism that I'm interested in is this normative individualism. And I don't think I've done a good job of explaining exactly what this is. So if anyone has a better way of phrasing this, please do tell me. But basically the idea is what should be done in a context is confined to the feasible actions of individuals. And this is different to Ross's definition, which I won't get into. But basically the idea is, if you have a question, who should help those living rough on the streets? Right? An answer to the normative individualist answer would be, oh, individuals should donate, should make their houses available to people, etc. Right? So it really is just what should be done in a context is just confined to the actions, the feasible actions of individuals. Okay, so with these notions of individualism at play or in mind, can we see any kind of individualism in conceptual engineering? Well, here, let's explore some quotes. Here are some recent formulations of the implementation challenge. Herman Kaplan and David Plunkett say, once you have settled on an ameliorative strategy, you might want to do some work to implement it. That is, you might want to engage in a bit of activism on behalf of your ameliorative strategy. If that's something you want to do, it raises an implementation challenge. How are ameliorative strategies best implemented? Here it looks like the you in question, the relevant person who's sort of implementing a concept is an individual. You want to engage in some activism on behalf of your strategy. Here's another quote by Alexis Burgess and David Plunkett. There's what we can call attempts at conceptual implementation. Roughly, this involves a kind of advocacy in which one tries to get some people, ranging from a lone individual to a large population, to actually take up and use the concepts one is in favor of. Again, it looks like there's the relevant person who's implementing is an individual when one tries to get some people to actually take up the concept and use the concepts one is in favor of. And beyond these formulations, there are also proposed implementation strategies. And these strategies tend to have the general form. Implementation strategies that focus on conceptual advocacy in speech situations, or what Mark Pinder, I think, has called narrow scope conceptual engineering, the goal of which is to change, I guess, linguistic usage in a context, which, if done enough, is apt to cause changes to the linguistic behavior more widely within a community. Right. So it's like doing stuff in speech situations, and then ideally, if you sort of do that enough across members of a community, then perhaps that will change linguistic behavior across the population. Okay, so who has advocated for this kind of position? Well, I think, and I could be wrong, but I think Dahlia's talk yesterday might be an example of this kind of strategy, but there are others in the literature who have offered an account like this. So I'm sorry, I should just say I'm going to talk about these speaker meaning views, but really all I'm interested in is linguistic usage, whether or not that's like meaning, neither here nor there for me. So yes, which means that the stuff I say about speaker meaning views also applies to these kind of meaning modulation views as well. So anyway, Mark Pinder says success on the speaker meaning approach is often easy. Situations commonly arise in which local conceptual engineering is called for. Even in wide scope cases, the speaker meaning approach admits of a clear, general strategy for achieving success. The conceptual engineer should publicize the new definition, building public momentum for its adoption. The conceptual engineer will need simple and intuitive definitions, compelling arguments, and powerful examples, as well as time, influence, and luck. So here it's like someone who accepts a particular kind of definition or use of a term, and they want to convince someone else to take it up in a conversational context. Sigurd Joram says something similar in a forthcoming paper that says, conceptual engineering could aim to affect what speakers communicate or what they attempt to communicate. In other words, conceptual engineers could attempt to affect the speaker meanings that we could assign to the expressions people use in context. Again, it looks like it's someone accepts a definition and they want to convince another person to take up that usage in the context. What I will say is that Joram also says the worth and feasibility of changing speaker meaning would not count for much if you could only cause a severely limited amount of speakers to adopt the meaning you prescribe. I want to sort of, I bring this up to flag that this is the kind of problem that I want to sort of really drive home at the end of this talk, is that if we actually can't do this in speech situations, get people to take up our particular usage, it's not going to be count for much. And that means we should really rethink our approach to the implementation challenge. Rachel Sturken says, ameliorators, given the right motivations, can use deviant communication to accomplish their projects of linguistic change. The disruption of standard communicative patterns can help them accomplish their goals. The disruptions are a good thing, as they can have the effect of making the hearer stop and reflect on her usage, and this reflection can be transformative. So here Rachel is talking about this idea that when you use an ameliorated word content pair in a metalinguistic exchange, it can cause another to counterfactually reflect on their linguistic usage or their linguistic decisions, and ideally they sort of change their kind of minds and they have this sort of transformative experience. And then Elizabeth Amber Cantalamessa says, conceptual activism is a type of linguistic intervention that takes place when speakers make claims that they believe to be trivial, overstated, incomplete, or simply false as a means of pragmatically subverting the received use of a term or concept, and to encourage their audience to lower their degree of confidence in their current concept or conceptual framework. So like Rachel, Elizabeth is interested in sort of using a word content pair, but the goal doesn't seem to be something like getting another to sort of take up the linguistic usage, preferred linguistic usage, but to actually just to get someone to downgrade their confidence in a word content pair. Okay, and the final person I want to mention is Max Deutsch, and this isn't because I think that he endorses a kind of view like this, but there's this sentence that I'm a bit skeptical of. He says, conceptual engineer might convince some speakers to speak or refer to something other than the semantic reference of free action or some other term when using the term. But this seems like a rather trivial and easy thing to do. Surely it is not the sort of thing the exciting terminology of conceptual engineering was designed to describe. What I'm going to suggest is actually really not easy. It's actually really hard. I don't know whether that adds to sort of, what makes conceptual engineering interesting, given that it's difficult. But I also want to sort of bring that up. Okay. So now the question is individualism in conceptual engineering? I think there are two things we might notice. They might notice something like an explanatory implementation individualism, which says that implementing an ameliorative strategy should be explained in terms of individuals and their interactions. And you might see a kind of normative implementation individualism, which is what should be done in a context in order to implement an ameliorative strategy is confined to the feasible actions of individuals. Okay, here's the big note. Despite reifying these positions and turning them into fully fledged things, no one has actually explicitly endorsed or advocated for explanatory or normative implementation individualism. So you might be thinking, you know, Paul, that's pretty strawmanny. What are you doing? But I think that I reify these for the purposes of for like cautioning. I'm saying both are paths that I think that we are kind of wrongly venturing towards, right? So recall the quotes above. You know, Capel and Plunker say, once you've settled on a ameliorative strategy, you might want to do something, some work to implement it. That is, you might want to engage in a bit of activism on behalf of your ameliorative strategy. And Alexis Burgess and Dave Plunkett say, there is what you can call attempts at conceptual implementation. Roughly, this involves a kind of advocacy in which one tries to get some people to actually take up and use the concepts one is in favor of. And they're the kind of individual conceptual advocacy people. Pinder and Yoram talk about speaker meanings. Sturken talks about transformative community of disruptions. Cantillo-Mesa talks about downgrading the confidence in the concept. And, oh, did I spell that wrong? I think I found it. Anyway, encourage metalinguistic awareness for those who were at the talk yesterday. So you might be thinking, what's so bad about individualism? What's the big deal? So what if we want to focus on what individuals can do in speech situations? Well, the point that I want to get across is this: an individualistic mindset about the implementation challenge incorrectly frames our perception, shape, and size, perception of the shape, size, and nature of the challenge of implementation, right? So consider the following question, just to sort of show why I think that this is a problem. Consider the following question posed by Sally Haslanger to illustrate the deficiency of explanatory ontological individualism outside of conceptual engineering. So Haslanger asked this question: why did the Native Americans in what is now northeastern United States rely on a diet of root vegetables in the winter months rather than leafy vegetables and fruits? She says the answer is this: because the climate and storage techniques available wouldn't support the preservation of leafy vegetables and fruits through winter. Right? Here, the explanation is in terms of the climate, technology, and the properties of leafy vegetables and fruit, not in terms of individuals and their interactions. But as Haslanger presses, surely the diet of Native Americans is a social phenomenon to be explained. So explanatory individualism is insufficient to capture all the relevant social facts. So the lesson is, I guess, this: if we are to explain all there is to some domain of social facts, we cannot restrict our attention or interest to individuals, their attitudes, and their interactions. And importantly, individualism is not sufficiently sensitive to the external social forces that encourage conformity to existing terms of social engagement. And I think that this applies also to the implementation challenge. There is a great deal of social infrastructure beyond individuals and their attitudes that drives the reproduction of classificatory dispositions within a community. What is conceptual reproduction? Here is a little fancy definition, which I'm not going to say out loud. I'm going to say the less fancy definition. It's the conceptual reproduction is a process by which a conceptual practice or certain dispositions with the term is sustained and maintained through the production or copying of early instances of that practice within a community. So basically, it's just like we're copying prior stable patterns of classification from the past, right? That's what conceptual reproduction is. And understanding conceptual reproduction is really important for conceptual engineering. Well, I'm arguing. The plans of conceptual engineers to implement an improvement to conceptual repertoire will have to negotiate the mechanisms that sustain extant conceptual practices. So part of the implementation challenge, I contend, is working out how to either work with or against conceptual reproduction. So we need to be aware of the reproductive forces that are actually just sort of maintaining the conceptual status quo. So you might think, okay, what are these mechanisms? Or what are these forces that are driving conceptual reproduction? All sorts of stuff, right? Social pressure, norm compliance, adhering to the thinking of parents, imitation of trendsetters, the state of material reality, and even things like Twitter and Facebook algorithms, echo chambers, communicative structures such as media presses, the education system, high-profile speaking platforms, testimonial change, common standards for assessing evidence, official historical narratives, and way more, right? Although some of these appear to be about individuals and their attitudes, we can't wholly explain each of these without knowing the state of the social environment. Right? You can't explain why social pressure is just, works without knowing exactly what's going on in the social environment that goes beyond individuals. So we need to understand facts about the social environment in order to explain the actions and attitudes of individuals. I hope this kind of shows that there's good reason to explore the notion of conceptual reproduction in the engineering literature. But in particular, to make sense of what features of the environment are drivers of conceptual reproduction. I'm going to focus now and for the rest of this talk, which is not much, on particular drivers of conceptual reproduction in conversational settings, just to show that individual conceptual advocacy is something that we shouldn't rely on as an implementation strategy. So one thing that drives conceptual reproduction is power dynamics, right? Which shouldn't be, a great surprise, but power dynamics infect reproductive processes within conversational contexts. So here are some examples. Chrissy Dotson talks about contributory injustice, and this occurs when a dominant group member fails in willful ignorance to take seriously the concepts developed within marginalized situatedness. So here we can see dominant concepts get reproduced because dominant people refuse to even entertain the possibility of taking up a marginalized concept. And this ignorance, even though it looks like it's an attitude or lack of attitude, whatever it is actually socially maintained. You can't explain this willful ignorance just by the attitudes of individuals. You need to know what's happening out there in the world, which sort of maintains the ignorance. Jonathan Jenkins Ichikawa talks about contextual injustice, which occurs when disadvantageous standards for knowledge are introduced into conversation through the raising of pernicious error possibilities. So this reproduces a kind of pernicious classificatory disposition with the term knowledge. And the success of raising an error possibility, arguably, will depend on what social environment you're embedded in, right? Whether or not the raising of an error possibility will actually sort of bring about contextual injustice will depend on whether or not you exist in a pernicious patriarchal society that treats women as sex objects, right? Something like that. And then I've got some stuff, some things in a paper in Hypatia and now a paper in Philosophical Quarterly on this notion of metalinguistic injustice, which occurs when one speaker has greater control in the joint activity of pairing contents with words owing to identity prejudice in the context. So what one can achieve in metalinguistic disagreement is linked up with systems of unjust hierarchy, not simply the attitudes of individuals. So I didn't go through all of these in great detail, but the idea is meant to be when we look beyond individuals to the social context and environment that they're situated in, we can see just how difficult it can be to implement an ameliorative strategy in conversation. How long do I have, Manuel? Should I be done? 2 minutes. Oh, gosh. All right. Here's what I'm going to say. Reproduction isn't bad. It's actually required for innovation, right? We need thinkers and speakers to conform to ameliorated classificatory practices as if such patterns are to gain community-wide uptake. But here's the problem. There are just drags in speech situations, such as metalinguistic exchanges, that will just tend to advantage the reproduction of existing terms of conceptual engagement. We just can't get away from it. So individuals on their own are often powerless against the conservative forces that keep things conceptually as they are. And so I think this casts a large shadow of doubt over the friendliness of speech situations within dominant audiences in particular as a site at which non-dominant classificatory practices can take root and propagate in dominant contexts. Put differently, conceptual other control is just far too hard in conversation. So what's the takeaway? Well, we can at least reject explanatory implementation individualism. We have to look at the broader social environment that drives and encourages conformity to existing conceptual practices and which stifles innovation. But when we achieve some innovation, we have to actually encourage conformity to sustain it, right? Can we reject normative implementation individualism? You might think, well, even if explanatory implementation individualism is bad, the normative burden on implementation might still fall on individuals. You might think that. But I still think we can reject normative implementation individualism because individuals are often powerless against the conservative forces that drive conceptual reproduction. Individuals can't really do much when it comes to convincing another person to take up a new concept. So we have to work together, but we should be careful about what this means. Groups are still limited in what they can achieve, even with respect to conceptual other control and virtue of their social situatedness. So simply appealing to groups plus time isn't the final answer. What is the final answer? Smaller communities. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.